The morning sun poured lazily across the tidy cul-de-sac of Brookstone Ridge, a seemingly idyllic gated community nestled in the outskirts of suburban Virginia. With its neatly trimmed hedges, pristine sidewalks, and homes that all looked just different enough to pass for unique, Brookstone Ridge was the kind of place where neighbors smiled politely from a distance and the grass always seemed a little too green to be real. But beneath the manicured lawns and white vinyl fences, a different kind of order ruled, one enforced not by the law but by the increasingly iron grip of the Homeowners Association. And at the center of it all stood Greg Mallory, a middle-aged man with too much time and far too little oversight. Greg wasn't an elected lawman. In fact, he wasn't a lawman at all. His claim to authority came from his self-proclaimed title as the HOA's security supervisor, a position he created and filled unilaterally after volunteering for the board 2 years earlier. At first, most residents thought it was harmless. Greg, a retired mall security guard with delusions of grandeur, had found purpose in patrolling the streets in a second-hand golf cart equipped with flashing yellow lights, a clipboard, and an old police-style belt he'd bought online. But over time, what began as harmless busy work morphed into something darker. He began issuing citations for things as absurd as improper trash bin placement and grass blades exceeding 3.5 inches. Residents who pushed back found themselves fined, targeted, or even threatened with lien notices from the HOA. Greg strutted around with the swagger of a man who believed the community was his personal jurisdiction. He patrolled during the day, at night, and even on weekends, always watching, always waiting for someone to step out of line. And no one dared challenge him. No one, until that morning. Logan Harper pulled his black Ford F-150 into the driveway of his father's newly purchased home on Cypress Lane. It had been years since he'd been back to Virginia. Deployments to the Middle East, South America, and Eastern Europe had kept him away. But now, with his latest mission behind him and leave approved, he was finally home. Logan wasn't just a soldier, he was Special Forces. A Green Beret with advanced weapons training, fluent in 4 languages, and capable of disassembling and reassembling a rifle blindfolded in under a minute. But none of that was visible at first glance. Dressed in jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, he looked like any other 30-something man unloading duffel bags and gear cases from the back of a truck. The moving van had dropped off the larger furniture earlier in the week, but Logan had insisted on handling his own gear personally. Much of it was military-issued, things you didn't just trust with strangers. He moved methodically, placing cases marked with coded labels onto the driveway, stacking them with care. His eyes scanned the neighborhood with automatic precision, noting exits, sight lines, and possible ambush points out of sheer habit. Old instincts died hard. He was midway through unloading when the distinct whir of an electric motor approached. The golf cart rounded the corner slowly, orange lights flickering like a toy version of a patrol vehicle. At the wheel sat Greg, clad in a tactical vest that bore a patch reading HOA Enforcement Unit, another of his self-made touches. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the morning sun as he pulled to a stop at the edge of the driveway. Logan glanced briefly, then went back to unloading. Greg cleared his throat and stepped out. "Excuse me," he barked with the tone of someone used to immediate obedience. "You can't park that here." Logan didn't look up. "It's a driveway." "That's not what I said. I said you can't park that truck here. That's a commercial vehicle. And this is a residential neighborhood. HOA regulations clearly state." Logan stood up slowly and turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, calm, composed, but with a flicker of steel beneath. "It's a private vehicle. Registered under my name. No business logo. No decals. Just a truck." Greg's jaw clenched. He didn't like being interrupted. "Don't get smart with me, son. I'm going to need to see some ID. And your HOA residency authorization form." Logan blinked slowly. "Authorization form? You heard me. I've never seen you around here. So either you're trespassing or you're violating the neighborhood's access policy. Which one is it?" Logan stepped forward slightly, just enough to cause Greg to instinctively take a step back. "My name is Logan Harper. My father just bought this house. I'm here helping him move in. You want ID, you'll need a warrant." Greg's eyes narrowed. "You think you're clever? I've had it with punk kids thinking they can disrespect the rules. This is a private community. We don't take kindly to strangers." "I'm not a stranger," Logan said, folding his arms. "I'm a resident's son, which means I have every right to be here. Greg's hand hovered near his hip, brushing the holster he wore, one with a very real Glock 19 inside. It was completely illegal for him to carry it while acting in any official capacity, but that didn't stop him. In his mind, he was the authority. The gun gave him power. Or so he believed. "I'm warning you," Greg said through clenched teeth. "Don't get aggressive with me. I will defend myself." "You're the one escalating," Logan replied coolly. "I'm unloading my truck. You pulled up yelling and demanding ID. I'm giving you one last chance," Greg snarled, pulling the gun and leveling it directly at Logan's chest. "Get on the ground. Now." Everything stopped. For a long moment there was only silence, the kind that follows a lightning strike. Birds stopped singing. The breeze stopped blowing. Even the distant hum of a lawnmower cut out like the world itself was holding its breath. Logan didn't flinch. His training took over instantly. 1,000 scenarios flashed through his mind. The stance, the grip, the tension in Greg's wrist, the trigger discipline sloppy. He knew exactly how long it would take for that finger to squeeze. He knew the man in front of him was untrained and scared, and he knew what had to happen. In one motion, Logan sidestepped the line of fire, grabbed Greg's wrist, twisted the gun downward, and disarmed him before Greg could even register what had happened. The weapon clattered harmlessly onto the concrete as Logan kicked it out of reach and swept Greg's legs from beneath him. Greg hit the ground with a thud, breath knocked from his lungs. Logan planted a knee on his back and pulled a zip tie from one of his duffels, restraining the flailing man with the efficiency of a seasoned operative. "You just pointed a loaded weapon at a U.S. service member on his own property," Logan said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You're lucky I didn't treat you like an enemy combatant." Greg sputtered beneath him, face pressed to the concrete. "You assaulted me. I'm HOA security." "You're nothing," Logan said coldly. "Not a cop. Not licensed. Not authorized. Just a wannabe playing dress-up." The commotion had drawn attention. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. A few had stepped outside, phones in hand. A woman down the street was already on the line with 911. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Logan stood up and stepped back, arms raised calmly. "He's restrained. The weapon's over there. I'm not a threat." Sheriff's deputies arrived moments later, guns drawn until Logan showed his military ID and explained the situation. Greg, now red-faced and trembling, was placed in cuffs and put in the back of a patrol car. Logan gave a statement, professional and precise, even as adrenaline still coursed through his veins. His father arrived shortly afterward, having just left a hardware store up the street. He listened to what had happened with a mixture of horror and pride. "You okay?" he asked, clapping a hand on Logan's shoulder. "I'm fine," Logan said, eye scanning the scene. "But I think this neighborhood has bigger problems than long grass or trash bins." The deputies agreed. What Greg had done wasn't just overreach, it was criminal. Brandishing a firearm, impersonating law enforcement, making threats. The HOA's behavior would come under scrutiny in the days that followed, but in that moment it was clear the illusion of power Greg clung to had shattered the moment he drew that gun. As the patrol cars drove off, Logan stood in the driveway watching the chaos settle. He wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. He was just alert, the way soldiers always are, even when the war is supposedly over. Because sometimes the real battles aren't fought overseas. They're fought in quiet neighborhoods against men with too much ego and not enough sense. And this battle had only just begun. The aftermath of the incident on Cypress Lane buzzed through the community like a wasp's nest cracked open. Residents whispered across fences, word traveled through text chains, and an uneasy fog of disbelief hung in the air. In Brookstone Ridge, where minor disturbances like barking dogs or improperly coiled hoses once prompted weeks of passive-aggressive HOA emails, the image of their so-called HOA cop being wrestled to the pavement and carted off by real law enforcement officers hit with the force of a hurricane. But what few people understood, what even the responding deputies had only begun to realize, was that Greg Mallory hadn't just picked a fight with the wrong resident. He had picked a fight with someone built to dismantle chaos. Logan Harper didn't want to be a spectacle. After the confrontation, he'd politely declined interviews, shunned reporters who began circling the neighborhood, and refused to post on social media despite several neighbors urging him to tell his side of the story. That wasn't his way. He hadn't joined the special forces to become a viral sensation or a community icon. His job had been to serve, to protect, and to make hard decisions under pressure, and even now, back on American soil, the instincts ran too deep to shed. But as much as Logan preferred silence, the neighborhood wasn't ready to let things go. The sheriff's department had opened a file on Greg. Internal communications were buzzing with procedural violations and legal ramifications. Still, what gnawed at Logan most wasn't just what had happened that morning, it was the bigger question forming in his mind. How had Greg gotten this far unchecked? That question started to find roots the next day. Logan was sitting at the kitchen table with his father, Jack Harper, a retired police sergeant who had served with distinction in Fairfax County for over 25 years. Jack had spent the first day after the incident reviewing the HOA handbook, which he'd found online in the community portal. What he discovered made him frown more than once. "Here," Jack said, sliding the printed papers across the table. Page 14. This clause gives board members the right to issue citations for rule violations. Nothing unusual about that. But look at how vague the language is. Violation severity and response methods may be interpreted at the discretion of the designated authority. That's a legal black hole. Logan leaned in, brow furrowing. They basically gave themselves unilateral power. "Exactly," Jack muttered. "This isn't oversight. This is overreach. And if Greg was walking around with a weapon and a badge, it means someone enabled him." Logan nodded slowly. "And we need to find out who." The father-son duo began what they called Phase 2, not in military terms but in investigation parlance. Logan's training in counterintelligence and infiltration had taught him that power structures often hid behind layers of bureaucracy. Jack's years in law enforcement meant he knew how to navigate red tape. Together, they began peeling back the layers. Their first stop was the HOA office, a converted bedroom in a model home repurposed into the Brookstone Ridge Welcome Center. A plaque by the door read Community Operations, but the office inside felt more like a command post for petty tyranny. Paperwork was stacked chaotically. Clipboards lined the walls, marked with cryptic codes like F7 bin violation and Lot 12, flag dispute. Behind the desk sat a woman named Brenda Wheaton, the HOA president. She was in her late 50s, wore thick glasses, and carried herself with the exhaustion of someone who'd spent a lifetime defending small kingdoms. She smiled when they entered but stiffened when she recognized Logan. "Mr. Harper," she said coolly. "I suppose you're here about what happened with Greg." Logan nodded, his tone measured. "I'm here because I need to know why someone under your authority was walking around armed, impersonating an officer, and threatening residents." Brenda bristled. "Greg was passionate. And yes, he may have taken his role too far. But he was only trying to keep the neighborhood safe. By pointing a gun at a resident?" Jack interjected, his voice hardened with the practiced edge of a career cop. "That's not passion. That's a felony." Brenda's face flushed. Greg was never formally authorized to carry a weapon. He did that of his own volition. "Yet no one stopped him," Logan said. "You let him patrol. You let him threaten people. And by the looks of this," he motioned to the stack of citation forms beside her, "you encouraged it." Brenda hesitated. "Look, this is a volunteer organization. We don't have the resources to vet every action taken by our board members. Greg handled security. We trusted him." Jack leaned forward, resting both palms on the desk. "So let me ask you this. Are you aware that impersonating a peace officer in Virginia is punishable by jail time and fines? Because right now, you're dangerously close to aiding and abetting." Brenda's lip twitched, the legal threat hitting home. I think it's best if you take up any formal complaints with our legal representative. I'm not at liberty to say anything else." Logan didn't push further. Not yet. He simply smiled, thanked her for her time, and walked out with his father. But as soon as the door shut, he turned to Jack. "She's hiding something. Obviously. She knows Greg was her muscle. The guy who made people afraid enough to pay fines without questions." "And if that's true," Logan said, "then there's likely more buried here. Greg was just the face. We need to see the guts." The next few days were spent gathering testimony. Neighbors came forward hesitantly at first, then more eagerly as word spread that someone was finally challenging the HOA machine. An elderly couple spoke of being fined $500 for placing their holiday lights up 3 days too early. A single mother described how her child's sidewalk chalk drawings were labeled graffiti and used as cause for formal warning. One man had even lost a job interview after Greg threatened to tow his car and left a boot on it overnight. But the most chilling testimony came from a resident named Alondra Vega. She was a nurse who had lived in Brookstone Ridge for 6 years. When Logan and Jack visited her, she invited them into her modest, well-kept home and brought out a manila envelope she'd kept hidden for months. "I didn't know what to do with this," she said. "I was scared. But after what happened to you..." Inside were copies of emails and letters Greg had sent her. They were laced with thinly veiled threats, citations for fabricated violations, notices of mounting fines, and, worst of all, a photograph of her car taken from inside her garage. "That one," she said, pointing to the photo, voice trembling, "was never sent to me officially. It was just left on my windshield. No note, just the picture. I don't know how he got inside. I changed the locks after that." Jack's face went stone cold. "He broke into your garage?" "I think so, but I couldn't prove it." Logan studied the photo. The angle was off, too high to be handheld. "Security camera. He used a mounted device." Jack nodded. "Which means premeditation. Surveillance." By the time they returned home that evening, Logan was done playing nice. He set up in his father's basement turned makeshift operations center and began organizing everything into folders: witness statements, copies of violations, HOA bylaws, public records, even drone footage he'd quietly collected of Greg's patrol routes in previous weeks. He used encrypted drives, created timelines, and built a digital map overlaying every citation location with Greg's known activity. Patterns emerged. Certain homes were targeted disproportionately. Residents who had once questioned HOA policies were fined repeatedly or threatened into silence. And in the center of it all stood Greg Mallory, the HOA's pit bull. Jack reached out to his old contacts in the sheriff's department and confirmed that Greg had never obtained a private security license. Worse, the gun he carried was unregistered. A ghost gun. Illegal. "That'll stick," Jack muttered. If nothing else, that alone could get him jail time. But Logan wasn't satisfied with just one man behind bars. Greg had been a symptom. The real disease was the power structure that allowed a man like him to thrive. So Logan did what he was trained to do: infiltrate, expose, dismantle. He filed a Freedom of Information Act request for HOA meeting minutes. When they arrived, Logan combed through them line by line and discovered something odd. Months where no official security decisions were recorded, yet multiple incidents had occurred. Logan recognized the signs. Decisions being made off the books. He dug deeper and found the smoking gun, a hidden folder in the HOA's digital server labeled Alt-Com Log. It had been poorly deleted but not wiped. Inside were emails between Greg, Brenda, and 2 other board members. The content ranged from casual to outright incriminating. "Greg, good work on shutting that guy down on lot 17. The way you handled that car situation was perfect. Scared him straight. Can you keep an eye on the Harpers? The old man's a retired cop and the kid looks military. We don't need them digging too deep. Greg, remember, keep things verbal unless you have to write. Brenda's worried about paper trails." Logan printed everything, documented the metadata, and compiled it all into a digital folder titled HOAgeddon. By the end of the week, he had a full case. Jack called his former precinct captain. The captain called the district attorney. Jack called his former precinct captain. The captain called the district attorney. 3 days later, the sheriff's department raided the HOA office. Computers were seized. Financial records taken. Greg, already out on bail, was rearrested on new charges, this time with enough evidence to deny further release. Brenda resigned. The remaining board members followed. Residents flooded the community green that evening. Some brought wine, others cake. People cried. Others just hugged. Logan tried to slip away unnoticed, but the crowd spotted him. Applause broke out. A few started chanting his name, and while he hated the attention, he allowed himself one moment of stillness as Jack clapped a hand on his back. "You did it," Jack said. "You took down the whole machine." Logan shook his head. "No, Dad. I just reminded people they didn't have to live under fear. That's what special forces are for. Not just fighting battles, but protecting people." Even here, the neighborhood had changed. The illusion of invulnerability around the HOA had shattered. And Greg Mallory had learned the hardest lesson of all: when you point a weapon at a warrior, you better be ready for what comes next. He hadn't been. The air in Brookstone Ridge was beginning to shift. Where once there had been fear and silence, now there was murmuring, a rising tide of questions, confessions, and courage. Logan Harper could feel it every time he walked down the street. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stopped to shake his hand. Others slipped manila envelopes or USB drives into his hands in broad daylight, no longer worried about being seen helping him. Greg Mallory had drawn his weapon on the wrong man, and now that man was turning over every stone, dragging rot into the light. The days following the HOA raid were chaotic. Logan's father, Jack, helped catalog the seized files as a civilian consultant working with the sheriff's department. While the legal team began piecing together a criminal case against Greg and the ousted board, Logan focused on what he did best: strategy, infiltration, and exposure. Though Greg was back in custody, the web of corruption extended far beyond him. Brenda Wheaton, the former HOA president, had claimed ignorance, insisting Greg acted alone. But Logan's instincts said otherwise. He didn't believe in lone wolves, not in organizations. Every tyrant had enablers. Every puppet had strings. And Logan intended to find the puppet master. He began by analyzing the HOA's financials, which had been poorly protected on the seized drives. What stood out immediately was the pattern of untraceable expense reports. Over the course of 18 months, large cash withdrawals labeled grounds improvement, security upgrades, and legal consulting had been filed monthly. But no vendor invoices were attached. No project completion reports. Just money, vanishing from the community account like water down a drain. One entry caught Logan's attention. Security contract, Watchtower Solutions, $18,750, quarterly. Watchtower Solutions wasn't a licensed security firm in the state. Logan ran a background check on the name and found nothing. No LLC registration, no local address, no tax filings. It was a shell, probably set up to funnel funds. He dug deeper and found 2 linked accounts that received consistent payments from Watchtower. Both led back to individuals tied to the HOA, one of them being Greg Mallory. The other was a man named Douglas Fenn, a former HOA board member who had quietly resigned a year ago. That same day, Logan visited Douglas's listed address, a home outside of Brookstone Ridge, about 30 minutes away in a gated development. The house was empty, vacant, mail piled up in the mailbox. A for sale by owner sign sagged in the front yard. Logan, staying out of sight, used a drone to scan the perimeter and then accessed property records at the local clerk's office. The deed had recently been transferred to a trust account in the Cayman Islands. Classic tactic for laundering funds. Returning home, Logan updated his corkboard map of Brookstone Ridge, connecting Greg, Brenda, and Douglas with red string. A triangle of corruption. But there were more strings to add. That evening, a knock came at the door. It was Mr. and Mrs. Godfrey, elderly residents from the north side of the neighborhood. They entered hesitantly, clutching a small hard drive. "We didn't know who to give this to," Mrs. Godfrey said, her voice trembling. "But you're the only one who's ever stood up to them." Logan opened the hard drive and found folders labeled with house numbers. Each contained photos, video snippets, even audio files. The timestamps went back 2 years. There were clips of residents arguing, private conversations captured from bushes, and photos of vehicles parked in driveways. "This isn't surveillance," Jack said grimly, peering over Logan's shoulder. "This is stalking." Mr. Godfrey looked down. "Greg came by every few months, saying he was monitoring community safety. We thought he was exaggerating. But he had a camera box installed under our gutters. We didn't know. A contractor found it last week during repairs." One video in particular made Logan's stomach knot. It showed the Vega family's daughter, no older than 6, playing in their front yard. Greg's voice could be heard off camera, muttering, "Looks like the chalk's back again." "That's a warning violation." "Jesus," Jack murmured. It was the kind of footage that turned public outrage into torches and pitchforks. The next morning, Logan compiled the most damning pieces: the illegal surveillance, the fake shell company, the financial embezzlement, and the pattern of resident intimidation into a dossier and sent it to a local investigative journalist, Trina Crowley. Trina was known for peeling back the layers of quiet suburban corruption, and she didn't disappoint. By the following evening, Channel 8 ran the headline, "HOA gone rogue, Illegal Surveillance and Financial Fraud Exposed in Brookstone Ridge. The segment showed Logan's face only briefly, blurred for privacy, but his voice was unmistakable. He spoke calmly, clearly. When someone points a gun at your family, it's not just a moment of fear. It's a declaration. And the only response is truth, exposing what they're really trying to protect. The story exploded across the county. Residents from nearby neighborhoods flooded online forums and HOA meetings, demanding audits. Channel 8 followed up with Part 2 of the report, focusing on Watchtower Solutions, the ghost company funneling HOA funds. That triggered a broader investigation by the state's Department of Consumer Affairs and the Attorney General's office. Meanwhile, Logan continued his own operation. Using his surveillance experience, he returned to the HOA's community office one night, now under lock and key but loosely guarded. He accessed the roof through a maintenance hatch and retrieved 2 hidden cameras Greg had installed, aimed at the parking lot and the sidewalk. The internal memory cards still recorded data. Logan extracted the files, scanned them, and found something he didn't expect. A late-night meeting dated 2 months prior. Brenda Wheaton, Douglas Fenn, and 2 unidentified men all meeting outside the office under cover of night. Audio was faint but decipherable with Logan's digital enhancements. "The money's clean," Douglas said. "What about enforcement?" asked one of the unknown men. "Greg's taking care of it. Residents are too afraid to talk. And if someone does?" Brenda's voice, "Then we deal with them. Quietly." That line, "deal with them quietly," would later become the smoking gun prosecutors used to secure multiple felony indictments. Still, the fight wasn't over. One morning, Logan's truck was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but his glove box was left wide open and a note had been pinned to the seat. "Soldiers die too." He stared at it without flinching. The handwriting was intentionally messy, likely traced with a stencil to avoid identification. But Logan recognized the tactic, psychological pressure. A classic move to destabilize or warn off threats. It didn't work. It just confirmed he was close to something or someone desperate. He turned the note over to the sheriff's department, who increased patrols around his home. Jack cleaned his shotgun. Logan installed a new set of encrypted cameras across the perimeter. But he didn't stop digging. What he found next broke the case wide open. Buried deep within the HOA's prior legal correspondence was a settlement letter signed and sealed related to a wrongful death lawsuit from 5 years ago. A man named Kevin Lamb, a former resident, had drowned in his own pool after allegedly falling unconscious due to faulty electrical wiring. The HOA claimed it was an accident, but a private investigator hired by Lamb's family alleged HOA negligence. Their security contractor had turned off power to the pool area as punishment for unpaid fines. The contractor? Greg Mallory. The case had been quietly settled for $250,000. There was no media coverage, no press release, no record of a change in HOA leadership, just silence and a sealed payout hidden in a footnote on the financial ledger. Logan presented the information to the Attorney General's office. The civil case reopened, and the Lamb family, still grieving, finally got a platform. Brookstone Ridge became the epicenter of a statewide movement. Homeowners associations across the region were audited. Legislation was proposed to increase transparency and limit enforcement powers of private neighborhood groups. The Brookstone Bill, they called it. And Logan, reluctantly, became the face of reform. In a rare public address at a town hall hosted at the local civic center, Logan stood before hundreds of residents, not just from Brookstone Ridge but from neighboring communities. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said. "But when someone abuses power under the shield of authority, someone has to stand up. That someone doesn't have to be special forces. They just have to refuse to be afraid." He looked at the front row where his father sat. Jack nodded, proud and quiet. Logan continued. Greg Mallory was not an anomaly. He was what happens when accountability disappears. But so is this moment. This is what happens when people unite. When fear turns into resolve. The crowd rose in applause. By the end of the month, criminal charges had been filed against Brenda Wheaton, Douglas Fenn, and 2 other former board members. They faced conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and aiding illegal surveillance. Greg Mallory's charges were expanded to include impersonating a law enforcement officer, aggravated assault, stalking, and unlawful weapons possession. But for Logan, justice was never about courtrooms. It was about restoring peace. One quiet evening, as the sun set over Brookstone Ridge, Logan stood in his backyard sipping coffee. A new breeze passed through the trees, lighter somehow, cleaner. His neighbor, Alondra Vega, waved from across the fence. Her daughter ran past, drawing in chalk again for the first time in months. No one stopped her. No citations. No threats. Just laughter. Jack stepped outside, resting a hand on Logan's shoulder. "You did good, son." Logan nodded. "It's not over. But it's better. Behind every curtain, there's someone pulling strings," Jack said. "But you showed them they can't stay hidden forever." Logan looked out across the homes, peaceful now, free. "Not while I'm here," he said. And for the first time in years, he let himself smile. The courtroom was hushed. Tension coiled in the air like a live wire. Every seat was filled, every aisle packed with reporters, neighbors, and families who had once whispered about Greg Mallory's authority and now sat unified by justice. On the stand, Logan Harper sat composed, a portrait of restraint and focus. He wore a charcoal gray suit with no tie, his special forces bearing evident in his upright posture and measured tone. The prosecutor asked him to recount the moment the so-called HOA cop pointed a gun at him and his son, and Logan did, calmly and precisely, without a shred of theatrics. Every word landed like a gavel strike. "He drew his weapon without cause, without provocation, and aimed it at my son's head," Logan stated. Not only was he not law enforcement, but he abused authority he never rightfully had. Greg sat at the defense table in a rumpled suit, bags under his eyes, his bravado long gone. He refused to meet Logan's gaze. Instead, he fidgeted with his cufflinks as if hoping he could rewind time to the moment before he mistook a special forces soldier for a passive homeowner. The trial was swift. The evidence against Greg was overwhelming. Illegal surveillance footage, financial documents tracing embezzled funds to shell companies, recorded audio of meetings plotting suppression, and testimonies from over 30 residents who had suffered threats, fines, and psychological manipulation under Greg's twisted rule. The kicker was the footage of Greg confronting Logan and Logan Jr., captured not only by Logan's home cameras but by Greg's own hidden surveillance system, which recorded the entire exchange, including his threats. It took the jury less than 5 hours to convict. The judge, a firm but fair woman named Judge Marlowe, read out the verdicts in clear, unwavering cadence. Gregory Malcolm Mallory, on the charge of aggravated assault, guilty. On the charge of impersonating a law enforcement officer, guilty. On the charge of stalking, fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful surveillance, guilty on all counts. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some cheered. Others wept in quiet vindication. Greg Mallory stood motionless, pale, as the bailiff placed handcuffs on his wrists. His sentence: 28 years without the possibility of parole for at least 15. The judge declared him a threat to community safety, citing the predatory abuse of power under the false guise of security. But justice didn't stop at Greg. Brenda Wheaton, the former HOA president, had attempted to flee the state after the indictments were announced, but she was arrested at the Oregon border. In her possession were $85,000 in unreported cash, burner phones, and forged documents attempting to open a new HOA in a small development outside Eugene. She pled guilty to multiple charges, including obstruction of justice, misappropriation of funds, and conspiracy. Her sentence: 12 years federal prison. Douglas Fenn and the remaining accomplices received between 5 and 10 years each, depending on their cooperation levels and involvement. Most residents found it poetic that those who once threatened them over trash can placement and uncut grass were now housed in federal correctional facilities. A stark reversal of power. With the old HOA board dismantled by court order, Brookstone Ridge entered a new era. The county appointed a temporary oversight committee composed of neutral community members, auditors, and legal experts. Their mission was to help the neighborhood transition into a resident-elected, transparent, and regulated homeowners council, answerable directly to county laws. No more private enforcement officers. No more backdoor contracts. Every rule had to be voted on. Every fine needed documented cause and appeal channels. Sunshine policies were put in place to prevent secret meetings. The books were open, the bylaws rewritten. Logan, despite being offered a leadership role multiple times, declined. He had no interest in power, only in peace. "I served my time leading men," he told the interim board. "Now I just want to live like everyone else with the freedom I fought for." Yet even without an official title, Logan was hailed as a hero not just in Brookstone Ridge but across the state. News outlets ran headlines like, "From Special Forces to Suburban Savior," and "How One Father Took Down a Corrupt HOA with Discipline and Truth." His face was on the evening news, but only briefly. He declined all major interviews. He didn't care for the spotlight. Instead, Logan spent his days rebuilding. Not just physically, though he did help renovate the now-defunct HOA office into a community recreation space, but emotionally. He hosted self-defense classes on weekends, teaching basic awareness and strategy. Jack helped too, running a side carpentry program for teens. The Harpers became anchors in the neighborhood, trusted, admired, and quietly respected. One of the most moving moments came during a memorial held for Kevin Lamb, the resident who had died years prior due to the HOA's negligent and punitive actions. Logan helped organize the service, inviting the Lamb family back to Brookstone Ridge. There, in the park renamed Lamb's Rest, Kevin's daughter planted a cherry blossom tree in his memory. As the crowd gathered beneath the new plaque inscribed with "Justice is the duty of the strong," the air felt different. No fear. No silence. Only peace. The children could be heard laughing again. One afternoon, Logan sat on his porch with a cold drink in hand, watching as neighbors passed by, waving and smiling. Logan Jr., now more confident and no longer bearing the lingering anxiety of that confrontation, rode his bike up the driveway and skidded to a stop. "Dad," he said breathlessly, "they want me to run for student council." Logan raised an eyebrow. "Is that right? They said I'm good at standing up to bullies." Logan chuckled and ruffled his son's hair. "You are. Just remember, leadership isn't about being the loudest. It's about protecting people, even when they don't realize they need protecting." Logan Jr. nodded, his expression serious. "Like you did." "No," Logan said with a small smile. "Like you did, you stayed calm. You stood your ground. You gave me the reason to act." Father and son sat quietly for a moment, the sun dipping below the trees. Days turned into weeks, then months. With the HOA reborn as a transparent, democratic body, resident satisfaction soared. Property values stabilized. New families moved in. Trust returned. People who had once whispered about fines now openly laughed about the past, using it as a lesson. Greg Mallory's name became a cautionary tale, the textbook case of what unchecked power could become. At a celebratory town hall held a year after the trials, the new council awarded Logan and Jack honorary service plaques, not just for their roles in uncovering corruption, but for the leadership, protection, and dignity they modeled throughout. Jack, ever the humble man, kept his plaque in the garage. Logan placed his above the fireplace, not as a trophy but as a reminder that evil doesn't always come dressed in darkness. Sometimes it wears a badge and smiles from behind a clipboard. Sometimes it hides behind bylaws and bureaucracy. But no matter the form, evil trembles before courage and collapses under truth. On the anniversary of the incident, Logan stood at the spot where Greg once drew his weapon. He took a deep breath, the crisp air filling his lungs. Then he stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. No fear in his step, no shadows behind his back. He had fought wars in foreign countries. He had led men into enemy fire. But the battle for his neighborhood, for his home, had tested him in a different way. And he had won. Not with violence, but with principle. Justice had been served. Not just for him, not just for his son, but for every homeowner who ever felt powerless, unheard, or afraid. Brookstone Ridge was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a symbol,